Welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. In this episode, Jessica, Chris and I are joined by Ian Isherwood and Stephen Trout. Ian is an Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College, and Stephen is a Professor of English at the University of Alabama. They are the authors of But It Still Goes On, Paul Fussell's The Great War and Memory at 50. Fussell's landmark book reshaped how we understand the cultural memory of the First World War, with its sharp focus on irony, disillusionment and the power of literature. It became a touchstone for scholars, students and readers alike. But 50 years on, how does Fussell's work hold up? What did he get right? What have we learned since? Welcome, Stephen, and Ian, welcome back. So in your paper, you start by exploring how Paul Fussell came to write The Great War and Modern Memory. And this is a book that Jessica recently wrote a blog on. She wishes she'd written.
Don't we all?
With sales figures of 30,000 and upwards. Yeah, don't we all? Well, I wondered, what's your personal connection with Fussell's work? How did you first encounter it? I don't know. Stephen, do you want to go first?
I read it maybe 5 or 6 years after it was published, when I was first really becoming interested in the cultural study of the First World War. And I can't remember the specific circumstances. I don't know who recommended the book to me or why I picked it up, but I remember recognizing that it was a really important study and one that I needed to look at. And I was just absolutely blown away by it. I couldn't put it down. And I have to say that I cannot say that of very many studies of literature. And certainly no one will ever say that of my own. But I literally could not put it down. And I think the thing for me that remains most captivating about Fussell, irrespective of all of the great ideas that I'm sure we're going to talk about, is just the verve of his writing. It just leaps off the page in a way that you simply don't find in very much literary scholarship. So, yeah, that was my first encounter with it.
Yeah, so mine was a little bit later. It was, and I think Jessica and I have shared this story with each other, but mine was, I think it was my freshman year of college. So that would have been 1996 or 1997, I think, is the first time I read it. And like Steve Trout, I was blown away because I'd never read a history book like it. I wasn't sure exactly if it was a history book. I was excited to think that it might be a history book, that maybe you could write history with such a aggressively polemical style. You know, I'd been reading some war literature. I wasn't sure if I was going to maybe double major in English or just stay as a history major, but I was kind of tempted by that, and because I really enjoyed reading war books. And then I read Fussell, and it was such an engaging way of talking about war literature's cultural impact, something I'd not really thought about that much. I mean, you just kind of assume that it has an impact, but you don't assume kind of how it deeply resonates within a culture, 50 years on, 100 years on. And so the book just stayed with me. And then later on, kind of arguing against Paul Fussell gave me a PhD thesis. So I've engaged with him at different times in different ways. And now Steve and I put together a piece that I'm kind of softening in my views toward Fussell.
I have a feeling having put out in the world that this is the book that, yes, I still wish I'd written. I think that I should probably explain how I came to it as well, which is actually, it's very close to Ian's. I too, and it was 1995 that it was assigned in my introduction to modern European history module was it as a first year undergraduate. So I read it and thought, goodness, can history be written like this, using fiction as a source, I think was the thing that caught me, and which is, as I say in the blog post, that's the thing that's continued to shape my historical practice. I've been using fiction as a historical source ever since. But it also coincided with having a lecture by Geoffrey Parker in which he explained how sunspots changed the course of early modern military history. And that was, again, one of those, oh my gosh, how can you make those connections moments for me, which, I'm not sure Parker was right. Going back now, X number of years later, with a bit more methodological experience under my belt, I'd probably be a lot more critical. But as an undergraduate, those two things came together in one of those moments of, this is what history can be, and turned me from being an English major into a history major. I can absolutely pinpoint it to that semester. There is something extraordinary for all the critique of Fussell as a historian, from the historical perspective. And there's a lot that he gets wrong, and there's a lot he overgeneralizes, and there's a lot that is really limited in terms of his source base. That ability to make you look again at what your assumptions are about the history of the First World War is still really important. And that's what I enjoyed about your article, was reminding us that that's the case, that it's not about the nitty-gritty details necessarily. He does something for the bigger picture.
So I encountered Fussell 2003, 2004 time. So I was a second year undergraduate. I was doing media studies at the time as part of my, as you all know, my successful career as a football commentator, which I continue to do to this day. Did like random school courses alongside it, and did one course on the Great War on writing or something like that. So it wasn't quite a history course, but it was close enough. Fussell and then Dan Todman were the point when, and God, this always makes me cringe looking back now. I've done lots of things in the past that you go, wow, I was dumb. But the idea, it was the first time I was introduced to the concept that the way we remember the past might not actually be the way that the past happened. And, when I tell my students that, or I've told my students that over the years, they just laugh at me. It's like, yeah, well, I was young and stupid. You're still young and annoying. But that concept was a big one for me, that actually it's not, necessarily remembering right or remembering it wrong. We might be remembering it different. It was a pretty big formative one for me, which I then, as I said, used as a football commentator.
I do wonder how, people are introduced to this as students. How do modern students 50 years later take to it when it's put to them? I think I was giving it to read during my master's, and I'm fairly confident I was the only person who managed to read the whole chapter we were expected to read.
I gave it to a chapter of it to my undergraduates, second year undergraduates on a popular culture or cultures of war module. And they really struggled with it, which I found really interesting. And it was a question for Steve, really, coming from an English department. I'm very aware of the critique it comes under as a historian, from a lot of historians. How does it fit in with the literature in an English department? Where does it fit, I suppose?
Well, I think his exclusion of women writers is really unforgivable in the eyes of a lot of literature scholars. And I've only taught the book at the graduate level, and I've experienced a good deal of pushback for that reason. It's almost as difficult as teaching Hemingway. Hemingway's murderously difficult to teach at this point in the 21st century. Everyone's convinced that Hemingway's a misogynist and racist and everything else. And so Fussell's dismissal of people who don't have direct combat experience is really problematic, I think, in the eyes of students. That said, I directed an MA thesis with one of Ian's former students, in fact, great young scholar named Annika Jensen, who's now at Davidson College. And she took to Fussell like a fish to water, had a very strident feminist perspective. And this surprised me. I think one of the things that she appreciated about Fussell is something that I've come to love about the Great War in modern memory. And we addressed this briefly in our piece. And that's this kind of two-way flow that he establishes between literature and history. So he uses history, or his version of it, or his understanding of it, which has various limitations, of course, that we recognize, as a context for or a backdrop for works of personal writing. But he also flips it around, and I love this. So literature provides a framework for understanding experience that then non-literary writers during World War I, just people writing letters home or people writing entries in their journals or whatever, they take these structures of meaning from literature and use it to render that experience. And I really think it's a wonderful thing about the book, that when I think about the Great War in modern memory, there are these salient chapters that really stand out that I think have stood the test of time very, very well. And I love the one, Oh, What a Literary War, where he says basically, not everyone in the British Army, but obviously men of a certain social background, we're all carrying copies of the Oxford Book of English Verse. And this becomes the source they draw upon for the language, for the imagery, with which to make sense of their experience. So I absolutely love that. And I think some students, and certainly this was the case with Annika, saw the genius in that. And in a sense, how far ahead of his time Paul Fussell was as a culture critic.
Point you raise in there about the critique of Fussell in the sense that, he if you don't have the right combat experience, you're of very little interest to Fussell and he gets kind of pushed aside, is a really interesting one, because that's also the critique that Carrington uses against Fussell, that he doesn't have the combat experience, he wasn't there. It's a really interesting kind of live by the sword, die by the sword kind of critique of Fussell's criticisms.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because they're both combat Gnostics, right? So they're both seeing the idea that there's this higher form of wisdom that comes from serving in war and that only people are there who can really understand it. And Chris, you're right on with the point that Charles Carrington, in his review of Paul Fussell's book, basically says to Fussell, you weren't there. So you certainly can't speak for my war generation, which I find that absolutely fascinating too.
Yeah, quite a lot of those people are now on Twitter saying exactly the same thing.
Yep, that's exactly right.
But the interesting thing is, then that gets, of course, picked up by Samuel Hynes, who, in The Soldier's Tale, that is his point, that it doesn't matter which war, that if you are in war, you witness war. So there's this really interesting ex-service discussion, from someone writing a book about ex-servicemen. I've just realized I'm going to have a whole section on what happens when you get with the Fussell Carrington Hynes debate, which is, who has the authority to speak, and who gets to bear witness, which, picking up on Steve's point about the lack of women, the role of women in bearing witness it is an unforgivable oversight, to be quite frank.
I think one of the things that Steve and I realized as we were sitting down and writing this piece was that for both Fussell and Carrington, that autobiographical drive is really important. One of the differences, I think, between the two of them is that Fussell is reading his own autobiography and other people and other soldiers' experiences. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And if you spend a lot of time in memory studies, you just kind of look at this and you're seeing this guy's individual memory as an American, as a Second World War combat veteran who happens to be an American, then looking at British memorial culture of the First World War and looking at British literature and kind of the great war books. And he's only focusing on, maybe a dozen significant works within the actual text or so, but that he's actually taking his own experiences and then kind of meshing them in with all of that. And then out of that comes this book that it's part literary criticism, it's part historical criticism. I mean, we're not sure how to categorize it. Like we say that in the piece, that we're not sure exactly what it is. The closest I think we came, Steve, was an intellectual thought experiment.
Yeah, it's an experimental work, and I think that's fair.
I wonder, to what extent is that what all scholars do? And that Fussell only is incredibly courageous for admitting it quite so blatantly. And I just think, because between reading your article and watching my blog post, I went to the celebration. There was a conference celebrating the 80th birthday of Jay Winter, who was my former supervisor and thesis examiner. And Jay's been equally explicit about the extent to which his historical research, and it's hugely varied in terms of methodology. I mean, he starts as a demographer and is now in museology fundamentally, having gone through shaping the landscape of cultural history. He's been stated quite explicitly that he studied the First World War because he couldn't face studying the Holocaust. That's where his autobiography shapes his approach to scholarship. So Fussell really challenges us as scholars to think about how much our own personal experience shapes our work, not just in terms of the opinions we bring, but actually the fundamental approach that we bring to it.
I remember was it last year that me and Ian met up in London for dinner, and as put enough First War historians together over dinner, and eventually it's going to start turning to Paul Fussell in some way, shape, or form. And we were having a conversation about the thing that this article that you were working on, and saying that of all the criticisms in regards to the historicalness of Fussell's work, the one that I've always found the most uncharitable is the criticism that he's not a historian, because exactly what you're saying in regards to it in an intellectual thought experiment. He never claims to be a historian. I think he very explicitly in the prologue explains that he's not a historian. So that's always felt like an odd straw man argument that historians have erected around him to critique a book, which, as you both said, there are things to critique in it. But you're not a historian has always seemed like a very low blow to somebody who isn't pretending that they are.
And when he does write history, I mean, so the section where he summarizes the entire history of the First World War, which is only about the Western Front. So when he summarizes it, if you're reading that seriously, you might be misreading it to some degree, because it is such a polemical interpretation of what the First World War was. It's almost like if you said to Robert Graves in the middle of writing Goodbye to All That, why don't you sit down and pen us a quick 2,000-word summary of the Western Front? That's kind of what Fussell's doing. And it's truly not good history, right? But that's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to frame a worldview. And he's trying to frame a way in which some of these writers are seeing that war and its experience. Now, not all of them, of course, but he's trying to frame at least part of it. So, yeah, I mean, I think Steve and I are pretty explicit about the fact that the work has significant historical faults to it. But again, Chris, to your point, that's not really what he's going for in the book.
I think also that there's a real sense of moral conviction that flows through the Great War in modern memory. And it's tied in, of course, with Fussell's own outrage over what happened to him as an infantry officer in the Second World War, and the features that he feels link his experience to that of Edmund Blunden or Robert Graves or Siegfried Sassoon. And there are just points in that book where Fussell's mad as hell. And he sees World War I basically the way that British troops saw the Battle of the Somme. It's the great fuck up. It's a catastrophe. It's a tragedy of epic proportions, and people get killed for no reason, and it's mismanaged, and it's horrible in every respect. This is arguably a one-dimensional sort of view of the First World War, I suppose, but it's one that really comes from Fussell's heart. And you feel it in that book. You feel it very, very intensely. One of the things that we pointed out about the book, and this is trite, but I think it's true, is that its weaknesses are also its greatest strengths. You can't disentangle them. So there's an element of explicit subjectivity in Fussell's approach that's problematic, but it fuels this sense of conviction that I'm speaking of, and that identification with these officers, which is problematic because they're of a different nationality in a different conflict. They're products of different historical circumstances and cultural forces. But this identification that he feels with them as a veteran of the Second World War is what drives that fervor. So for me, it would be extremely problematic to hand the book to a student and say, this is the last word on World War I. I think you're going to get a rather problematic vision of the conflict. But to hand it to a student and say, this is a product of a particular writer's point of view at a particular point in time, shaped by a kind of willingness to be experimental and to be polemical, then absolutely students should read it. They should read it as part of obviously of a collection of books that have different perspectives on the war.
I think that may be the problem with being introduced to it the way Ian or I was introduced to it, or even possibly the way I used it for my second year students, in that at that stage, if you're saying to a first year undergraduate, here's a book about the First World War, the inclination is still to take it as this is the last word on the First World War, or this is an introductory text on the First World War, and to take that 200-word pen portrait and not have the tools to put it in context. And it's really interesting. I don't know the extent to which it's still used at undergraduate teaching in the US, but that attitude, that perspective on the First World War as intensely futile, the perspective that Dan Todman argues against in The Great War Myth and Memory, still seems very dominant in the US students I have coming over to do postgraduate work, their understanding of the First World War. Whereas my sense is that undergraduate teaching in the UK has rode back from that way of introducing the history of the First World War. There's some interesting cultural differences there. I'd be interested to know how often Fussell turns up on undergraduate reading lists on US programs versus UK programs.
I don't know to the extent to which he's formally taught, but we do reference in our piece this situation of being in a social situation, and someone finds out that you study World War I, and the first thing they say is, "Oh, I've read The Great War in Modern Memory." And I think sometimes that's maybe the only book that the person has read on the First World War, and I think that speaks to the problem that you're addressing.
I think this the point you're making about viewing Fussell's work is in polemical, in angry, in emotional terms is a very good way of structuring a lesson to undergraduates around, because you could put Fussell and AJP Taylor together in a very interesting way to explain to students that they're not writing about the First World War because it's history. They're writing about it because they're angry, it's personal, it's political. It humanizes scholars of the past in a way that detaches them from the spectre of truth with a capital T. So actually, these are people writing about something that moves them in some way. And if they were doing it in the 1960s and the 1970s, what makes us think they're not doing it now? And in that way, you don't even necessarily have to talk about the First World War. It's irrelevant, except for the fact it's the focus of Fussell's anger.
Yeah, and when you mention the 60s and 70s, there's the backdrop of the American War in Vietnam, which we tried to bring out in our piece, which I think is extremely important, because I think there's a sense that Fussell sees all kinds of dangerous parallels between those two conflicts: incompetent leadership, corruption of language, insidious propaganda, all kinds of parallels. And so I think it's important to see that that's looming in the background.
In fact, thinking about it, and simply because I have a reputation to maintain, that idea of having AJP Taylor and Paul Fussell played against each other, if bringing in the Vietnam angle, I think you could make a really interesting undergraduate seminar by putting George Lucas and Paul Fussell together as reactions to the Vietnam War, using history as a voice for anger. I reckon I'll just clock off now, actually. Everyone have a great time.
You've said what you came to say.
Now I'm trying to think of who the Charles Carrington is of the Star Wars universe, because there's got to be one. So Chris, that's your homework. You got to work on that.
I'm slightly intrigued by the fact that Fussell's an American in Britain in that sort of early 70s period with the Vietnam backdrop. And it's the Britishness of his thinking, of the things that he's looking at. I wonder how much Britain at that period is also, because you've got kind of the Peter Cooks, the David Fussell, those irony, that satire comedy that's coming out of the 60s, I guess rolls into the 70s. And how much that's imprinting upon his work as well when he suddenly comes to England. I don't know how big that kind of thing was, if it transferred itself to the States. Or if he sort of dropped in and it's an eye-opener and it fires things off in his mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that Fussell, so his academic specialty was 18th century English literature. He focused a lot on satirists in the 18th century. So kind of his mind was already moving in that direction. And then when he comes over to do his research for the Great War in Modern Memory, he goes to the IWM. So he's actually in residence for basically a sabbatical in London, and he goes in 6 days a week to just read in the IWM. And so I'm not sure what he's doing in the evenings. I'm not sure what he's watching on TV or what he's absorbing of British culture. But it's clear from not only the Great War in Modern Memory, but then from his later writings that he is, Paul Fussell is just immersed in this world of irony. His book Class is one of these books that you can't read it seriously. You have to read it as kind of, again, an intellectual, humoristic thought experiment about class in American society. So his essay, Thank God for the Atomic Bomb, which used to be taught in American composition classes, right, Steve? In English 101, that was like
not anymore.
Yeah, it's not taught anymore. But Fussell had a deeply ironic sensibility in general, and a curmudgeonly persona that I think he liked to present.
Well, to go back to Chris's point, it would be interesting to teach Fussell in a creative nonfiction course. I think that would really, really be interesting. And I was just thinking about this whole question that Angus brought up about Fussell's sort of position as an Anglophile, writing about this experience that's to some extent alien and in other ways arguably familiar. I think the role of imagination in this book is really, really important. And I was thinking back to that passage that we quote from in the piece, where Fussell says that while he's in the reading room at the Imperial War Museum, going through all of these accounts and looking at all of these artifacts, some of them still encrusted with the mud of the Western Front, and he says that in a sense he imagines himself as one of those soldiers. It's a really remarkable passage. He feels along the seam of his trousers, for the for lice, for cooties, right? He imagines going over the bags, quote unquote, in one of these charges across no man's land, and he gives you this wonderful sort of catalog of little snippets of British experience on the Western Front, and he's in his imagination he's embodying this, right? He's imagining himself as a British soldier at that moment. And so this may be another feature of the book that we don't talk enough about. We talk about Fussell as a historian, or whether or not Fussell should even be critiqued as a historian. We talk about him as a cutting edge, a scholar of cultural studies or memory studies who's ahead of his time. But this is also in many rewarding respects a powerful work of imagination. And maybe that's why it could have a place in a creative nonfiction course, and that might be a productive way to approach it.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that imagination is one of the ways in which a certain type of military historian does critique Fussell. From my own perspective, perhaps unacknowledged, is the fact that reading it at an impressionable age gave me permission to do the research that I do. And I know I've told the story before of being faced in a seminar just after I finished my PhD by a male member of the audience who told me that I couldn't write about masculinity in the First World War because I hadn't served in the war and I wasn't male. And I'm sure actually Paul Fussell would probably said exactly the same thing, to be quite frank. But at the same time, what his imaginative leap in thinking that he, as an American ex-serviceman of the Second World War, had an understanding of what these soldiers of the First World War, British soldiers of the First World War, had been through, gave me permission to use similar material to make that imaginative leap myself, without nearly the literary brio that Fussell brings to it. In that sense, it's not just the cultural source material that is so important in shaping the field. It is that sense that, back to that question, what is it that histories do? Wow, they can allow, doing history can mean making imaginative leaps to connect to the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of your point, Jessica, and Steve, to yours earlier about how you construct a narrative like this. One of the things that I find interesting about this work is that Fussell's thinking, and he's not writing as much about this as I wish he would have, but he's thinking like a memoirist as he's putting together this book, right? So the book reads in many ways as a combined series of memories that he's drawing all together, taking literary sources and trying to make truth out of them. But as you know, when you study enough memoirs and when you read enough First World War memoirs in particular, it's a very difficult thing for a veteran to take something that's deeply traumatizing, that they have very strong feelings about, and then to create a clear narrative from that then other people are going to be using as evidence, right? So when you look at historians, oftentimes looking at memoirs, of course, there's a whole camp of historians who are saying, well, they're entirely unreliable, but we will borrow phrases here and there as like color commentary in what we work on. Well, Fussell's saying, well, why don't we take the memoir seriously, even if it is mythologized? Like, so what if it's myth? Myth can have truth in it. And so he's able to kind of look at this from a different perspective than how a historian might be treating the same source materials. And then combining all those memoirs and those stories all together, he's not exactly doing what Samuel Hynes is doing in The Soldier's Tale, but he's doing something that's kind of adjacent to it, where he's trying to understand how they go together.
I mean, you can trace a path from what Fussell does in The Great War in Modern Memory, not only to The Soldier's Tale, but also to A War Imagined, where Hynes makes that exact very explicit point about myth and why why we need to read the myth if we're going to understand the culture that it emerged from.
I think the trajectory of Fussell's career is really important here too. And if you think about, we have a trio of texts. So we have the Great War in Modern Memory, and then in the 80s we get Wartime, which is just excoriating attack on the various ways in which American culture has prettified the Second World War. And then this leads almost with a sense of inevitability to Fussell's own autobiography, which is Doing Battle, where he really lays bare his own trauma as a combat veteran of the Second World War. So there's almost a sense when you read that trio of texts, like the path is leading inevitably toward memoir, Fussell's own memoir, his own self-disclosure. It's dealt with in a kind of indirect, shadowy way in the Great War in Modern Memory. I mean, you sense it in the background all the time, and he reminds you of it at some specific moments. And then it becomes more explicit in Wartime that his cultural critique is informed by this very personal vision and store of experience. And then you get to Doing Battle, and he just lays it all out. So I think that's another interesting thing to consider. Is the Great War in Modern Memory in a strange way a kind of shadow memoir? And I think it is in some respects. And I think when we think about the sources of Fussell's creativity, I'd say definitely so.
I had wondered if he'd revised it towards the end of his life, if it had set a train of thought going, and if he revised it and rewrote it, how different it would be once he'd sort of ruminated on it, and he's writing it now as those old men were reading it in the 70s who'd served in the First World War, how it would have changed his thinking.
I'm tempted to say not at all. I'm not sure Fussell changes his mind on much of anything, is my sense. He seemed to me to have been a person who clung to his views with a certain tenacity. So I'm not sure he would have. Now, I say that though, but if you read his last book, the Boys' Crusade, which is a very slight production, I almost think it's unfortunate that Fussell published it. I think it's his weakest book. It's very short. It's very superficial, but it deals with in very general terms the experiences of young American officers in France and Germany, like himself at the close of the Second World War. I won't say it's a positive counterbalance to Wartime, but it is a little bit more positive. Would you agree, Ian?
Yeah, it's softer it's soft.
Yeah, he wanted to soften it just a little bit at the end. So maybe he does change his mind about things. I don't know.
Before we started recording, I think we were talking briefly about the different editions of The Great War in Modern Memory, because there was a 25th anniversary edition, which apparently great for podcasting and radio, had a gold band on it. Mine is older than that, my copy. Did he ever write, with the reissues, did he ever write an introduction to
he does for the 25th anniversary. And he addresses, and I can't remember what he says. So one of the things he addresses is the criticism that he's not a historian. So he does, address that within that intro. That being said, he doesn't change the text. I mean, the text remains what it is. One of the things that Steve and I really enjoyed was trying to figure out which war writer that Paul Fussell was identifying with the most. And eventually we circled around on Robert Graves. I think his treatment of Robert Graves is probably, at least in my opinion, it's the best treatment of any author in the book. But it becomes clear, at least for me, that when you're reading his take on Graves, that he's very much describing himself. And so part of this book, I mean, this isn't him saying goodbye to all that. I think he'll try to do that later in some of his World War II books. But clearly there was something about Graves that really stuck to him. I think they probably were a similar type of junior officer.
I mean, we make the point at the close of our piece that the Great War in Modern Memory shares many affinities with Goodbye to All That. Every adjective you can use to describe Fussell's book can apply to Graves. I mean, they're both polemical. They're both consciously outrageous. They're both perfectly willing to burn bridges and skewer sacred cows, to mix metaphors. I mean, they're two of a kind. Graves lived a long time. What year did he die in?
Early 80s, right?
Yeah. So he's on Majorca, and everybody makes the pilgrimage to Majorca to meet the great Robert Graves. Did Fussell and Graves ever meet? This was something that I wondered about after we finished our piece. I wonder if anyone here knows, did he ever meet Robert Graves?
No, I don't know.
That was part of the article that I found very convincing, was that argument you make about the similarity between the two. And it's quite interesting because I think that points to a cultural legacy for Great War modern memory, which is the extent to which Robert Graves continues to shape the way fiction is written about the First World War today. In that Pat Barker uses Robert Graves as uses Goodbye to All That as a main source. And that in turn has meant that Alice Wynne has used Goodbye to All That as a primary source, to the point of I suspect, actually lifting whole scenes from it. That's the legacy of Goodbye to All That in some ways, more than its legacy in terms of academic history and the way in which we teach it to undergraduates. The view of the First World War and its culture has been the underpinning of so much of contemporary literary cultures about the First World War, which then have shaped filmic representations, much more so than any other book I can think of. And that's an extraordinary legacy.
No, I think that's right. The irony is, we were talking earlier about the difficulties one encounters teaching the Great War in modern memory. If any of you have had any success teaching Goodbye to All That, please jump in. It's unteachable. I've tried over and over again. I've tried with advanced undergraduate students. I've tried with graduate level students. The book is too British. I wind up spending 3 weeks explaining the class nuances of what's going on, and the students don't care. They don't get Graves' sense of humor at all. They don't find the book funny. They regard him as sexist and boorish and on and on and on and on. I've just never had any success teaching Goodbye to All That, which is a shame because it's one of my favorite books of all time. But I guess I wondered at this juncture, have any of you had any luck teaching Robert Graves in a World War I seminar?
I mean, I've sparked a reaction. And I put it so
I did that.
well, a couple times I put him up next to Manning, so students had to read Graves first and then read Manning, and they almost invariably say to me, "Why didn't you just give us Manning?" Like, what?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've ever taught it. I'm
not giving you a lot of encouragement to do so, am I?
Well, it's partly because I don't sort of teach full memoir texts in quite that way. I've never taught Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. I use both as examples, particularly my historiography lecture, because I lecture on a methodology module for first-year undergraduates about primary versus secondary literature, what counts, and pointing out the ways in which memoir can be used as both. And actually, Fussell, The Great War of Modern Memory, turns up for exactly the reasons we've been discussing, that it is a work of secondary literature that actually is probably more useful as a work of as a primary source to understand about the moment that Fussell's writing in. But I don't think I've ever taught the text itself.
It was in your distance learning MOOC that you did in 2014.
Where? It's so long ago that
I honestly can't remember because I just know it was there. That was when I read it last.
You see, that's interesting because that was aimed at a slightly different audience, of course. That wasn't the standard undergraduate as part of a wider history degree. That was aimed at people who wanted to do a module on the First World War, probably as part of the centenary, and more likely aimed at people, the sort of University of the Third Age type student, people who are learning for learning's sake in that sense.
I wasn't that old.
Motivation, Angus, and I don't think you fit the average age profile either. I think you brought down the average.
This actually brings up an issue. I'm curious to know what all of you think of this. So Ian and I were a bit hard on Fussell for including David Jones in parenthesis. I think it's fair to say that neither one of us is a fan of that particular work. I find it absolutely turgid. I cannot get through it. And I understand the point that Fussell is making about it. And his point is essentially that the work is a failure, that it's trying to bring a kind of heroic stature to the actions of British infantry on the Western Front. And that heroic stature doesn't fit this war. It doesn't fit this moment in history. And so it creates a kind of falsified view of it. But that's a long chapter in the book, talking about a text that's obscure and almost unreadable. To go back to your points, Jessica, about goodbye to all that, I think The Great War in Modern Memory helps boost Goodbye to All That, as a major work, not just of World War I literature, but of world literature. And I think it has the same effect to perhaps a lesser extent on Undertones of War and volumes in the Sherston trilogy.
I'm not that big a Graves fan as much as I love I Claudius and the rest of it. If I was going to choose a great work of literature to boost, I'd be with your students, Ian, and go with Her Private Suite. I think it's a much, much better book all round. And actually, I'd probably go for Subaltern on the Somme as my second choice, which is the one I quote endlessly from.
That's a great book.
Is that Carrington?
No, it's Max Ploughman.
Max Ploughman. Carrington's A Subaltern's War.
I love Subaltern on the Somme. That's the one I identify with, but he's also much younger than Graves, which is an interesting facet to it. He's a very young man when he serves as an infantry officer. In parenthesis is interesting because part of the argument that Fussell's making, of course, is about folk literature. And there is a sort of folk revival element, going back to your point, Angus, about the moment in the 1960s that may have driven that choice, that sense of Welshness underpin, and very specific Welsh culture that underpins, in parenthesis.
I think the survey of myth, ritual, and romance that's in the chapter on in parenthesis, isn't it? Where he talks about the trench legends and the all of the various ways in which people were making sense of experience through bizarre tales that were passed around and so forth. I think that holds up really well. I think that's interesting. But I feel like in parenthesis is so obscure, so challenging that it's one of the rare points, I think, in The Great War in Modern Memory where the book actually becomes a little bit dull. And Ian and I pondered, in fact, I don't think we reached any real conclusions. You can please jump in, Ian, but why Fussell didn't include Manning's The Middle Parts of Fortune. Fussell goes on to write a great foreword to that book when it's reissued by Penguin, I think in the 90s. And I wonder, in a way, if it wasn't going to break up the kind of consistency and perspective that he achieves, for better or worse, in The Great War in Modern Memory. I mean, he's interested in English subaltern experience, and Manning's Australian. He serves as an enlisted man. He's this strange figure who doesn't quite fit easily into any category. And in some respects, I wish he had included Manning, because I think it would have forced him maybe to reevaluate some of his own assumptions running throughout the work. Again, I wouldn't want Fussell to be anything other than the delightful polemicist that he was, but Manning would have complicated things in perhaps some interesting respects. Yeah.
I think that's my critique. Alongside the women, this is a very narrow vision of class. And that's actually, much as critiquing Fussell was Ian's into his PhD, mine was the same, of saying Fussell rests on this very narrow class, in all senses of the word, of writers. But there are so many other men who are writing in so many other different ways. And I went back and interrogated that assertion that they're all drawing on the same set of myths, particularly the myth of the hero. That was my PhD fundamentally. So I don't think Fussell could have done what he did if he had included Manning. To be honest, it would have been too much of a challenge to that central argument that he was making.
Definitely. I mean, I'm right with you, Steve and Jessica. I mean, I think the book is, Manning's too much of an outlier for him. But he's also interested in people that he identifies with, both in terms of his own class and background, as well as people that he identifies with in terms of their sensibility. So Fussell is a myth maker. He's doing the same thing that some people were doing in the late 1920s and being kind of a propagandist for some war writers while also ignoring all the other.
And I wonder if Manning's alcoholism got in the way of him being able to acknowledge an identification.
What do your students respond to in Manning, Ian?
Well, they see it as kind of a very modern war story. I mean, they're used to the type of war stories that they have consumed for most of their lives come from film, and they're small unit buddy movies, right? They're things like Platoon or Full Metal Jacket or Saving Private Ryan, where they're about small unit actions essentially and about squad life. And so they're very interested in kind of the squad life aspect to it, what's being said over the brazier, not necessarily. But in a similar way, whenever I have taught and show is it 2017 film version of Journey's End? So whenever I've shown that and taught the play, they identify with the same thing, with the sense of kind of comradeship, with that idea of like doomed heroism. And I think in both of those books, there's an element there that is pushing back against Fussell very much so, especially with Journey's End, because the officers that are represented there are not the same kind of officers that Paul Fussell is interested in. And so I think that, that's part of why I see him kind of focusing on the people that he's focusing on, is because he wants that consistency with his argument. And that's a major flaw within the book.
Well, I'm slightly conscious of time. So yes, we should perhaps wrap things up. Chris, do we know where we are next? Are we, Jessica? Are we looking at
The Boy Who Loved Me?
I'm hoping we are going to look at The Boy I Loved. That I will finally manage to corral our youth focus group on the book.
Yeah, now that they've finished wasting their times on their own GCSE exams and start thinking about us and our needs.
Yes, so hopefully I can hijack their holidays briefly and talk about it with them, and we can come back and discuss that in more detail.
Very good. Well, look forward to that. Well, Ian, Stephen, thank you for that. It was good. It was, and we'll put a link in the show notes for the paper.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Great to meet everybody.